The sun, crimson and bleeding like a wound on the horizon, slowly sank into a thick, viscous haze. Daniel Parker, his face crisscrossed with wrinkles like a map of the terrain he knew by heart, pulled his old pickup truck to the side of the broken forest road. The truck, having seen better days, gave one last rattling cough before dying. The silence, which was usually teeming with forest sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling, streams gurgling, was replaced by an ominous, oppressive stillness. "Bitter marshes," Daniel muttered, his voice raspy and creaky like autumn leaves grinding underfoot. He glanced at the dilapidated sign, overgrown with moss and lichen, its letters scratched roughly and unevenly, as if by animal claws. Daniel knew these places better than anyone, having grown up in the shadow of the ancient forest. But even to him, this part of the landscape inspired a chilling, superstitious fear. He wasn't here by choice. A young cop, a rookie named Riley, whose youthful enthusiasm hadn't yet been broken by reality, insisted that Daniel, as a local expert, help in the search for a missing hiker. The guy, Kevin Mason, was from the city, and apparently thought the Bitter Marshes were the perfect place for an adventurous hike. Daniel grimaced, remembering the guy's cocky expression when he asked about local legends. Fool. Daniel climbed out of the truck, his old bones protesting with aching pain. He was old, very old, and felt every year he'd lived, especially in the raw, penetrating air of the marshes. He retrieved his old shotgun from the truck bed, a trusty Remington 870, battle-hardened, that had seen more than most people do in several lifetimes. With a familiar motion, he checked the shells, his hands moving slowly but surely. In the Bitter Marshes, you can't afford to be careless. He stepped under the canopy of trees. The air immediately became thick and humid, heavy as wet wool, saturated with the smell of rot, decaying leaves, and stagnant water. The trees, ancient oaks and gnarled pines, stood close together, their branches intertwined in a morbid, gloomy vault, as if trying to suffocate the last rays of the setting sun. Light barely penetrated the foliage, plunging the ground into an oppressive twilight, where shadows danced sinisterly. Beneath his feet, the damp, yielding earth squelched, mixed with decomposing leaves and mud, each step accompanied by a nasty, sucking sound. Daniel walked slowly, cautiously, looking around carefully. He knew that the Bitter Marshes were deceptive, like a beautiful woman hiding poison beneath her smile. You could easily get lost here, even if you knew the terrain like the back of your hand. The paths twisted and turned, like disturbed snakes, and the landmarks changed every minute, as if moved by an invisible hand. He remembered the stories his grandfather, an old Cherokee Indian, told him about the spirits living in the swamp, how they lead people astray, luring them into their domains. Daniel used to consider them fairy tales, but over the years he had begun to doubt. Soon he came across the first clue, a torn piece of a map lying in the mud at the roots of a huge, rotted tree. Daniel picked it up and examined it carefully. It was a tourist map, bought probably in the nearest town, but it had strange symbols drawn on it, symbols that were definitely not on the original. Runes? Or just meaningless scribbles? He frowned. Kevin was clearly trying to draw his own map, or more likely believed some local legend about treasures hidden in the swamp, or a cursed Indian burial ground. City folks loved those stories. Daniel continued his journey, deeper into the heart of the swamp. The further he went, the stronger the smell of rot and decay became, making his throat itch and his head spin. He heard strange sounds, a soft whisper, coming as if from under the ground, like the voices of the dead trying to break free, and a dull, rhythmic thud, resembling either a heartbeat or the sound of falling drops in a dark cave, making his skin crawl. Suddenly he stopped, as if he'd run into an invisible wall. Ahead, between the gnarled trees, he saw something strange, something that stood out from the familiar landscape. A small clearing, lit by a ghostly moonlight that pierced through the dense foliage. In the middle of the clearing stood a lonely, twisted tree, its bare branches reaching towards the sky like bony fingers. Hanging from the branches were some objects, swaying in time with an inaudible wind. Daniel squinted, trying to make them out in the twilight. As he got closer, his heart pounded in his chest like a trapped bird. They were bones, human bones. They were tied together with thin, decayed ropes and hung from the branches of the tree like a gruesome ritual decoration. The skulls were turned towards the ground, their empty eye sockets staring into the depths of the swamp, as if calling out to something that lived below. Thighs, arms, ribs, vertebrae, all intertwined in a sinister garland of death. Daniel felt nausea rising in his throat, mixed with icy fear. He knew that the Bitter Marshes were not a good place, cursed, but he had never seen anything like this, even in the most horrible nightmares. Someone here was doing something vile, horrifying, inhuman. It wasn't just murder, it was desecration, a ritual, a mockery of life and death. He slowly circled the tree, carefully examining the ground beneath it. Soon he found another clue, a small folding knife lying in the grass, stained with mud and dried blood. The name Kevin Mason was engraved on the knife handle. Daniel turned cold, as if doused in icy water. This meant that Kevin had been here, at this tree of death. But what happened to him? Why did he drop the knife? And who hung these bones on the tree? Who or what turned him into this gruesome display? He heard a rustling in the bushes. To his left, he sharply turned, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. Something was definitely in the bushes. He felt it in his skin, felt someone's presence, someone's invisible eyes watching him. It was watching him, waiting for the moment, like a predator stalking its prey. "Who's there?" Daniel shouted, his voice trembling despite all his attempts to appear fearless. No one answered from the bushes, only the rustling of leaves, amplified by the silence of the swamp, and that soft, barely audible whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the voices of spirits surrounding him on all sides. Daniel slowly, cautiously approached the bushes, his finger on the shotgun trigger, ready to fire at any moment. He parted the thorny branches and froze, rooted to the spot. There was no one in the bushes, nothing but thick, impenetrable darkness and the smell of rot. But something was wrong. Something had changed, subtly but perceptibly. He felt it in his skin, in his gut. The air became heavier, thicker, as if he could touch it with his hands. The smell of rot, stronger, more nauseating, and the silence became more sinister, more oppressive, like before a storm. He slowly turned and looked at the tree with the bones. It looked different, more sinister, more threatening. The skulls seemed to be turned directly towards him, their empty eye sockets seeming to stare right into his soul, seeking out his weaknesses, his fears. And then he heard the thud, a dull, rhythmic thud that he'd heard before when walking through the swamp. But now it was closer, much closer, right below him. He looked down, at the ground beneath his feet. From the earth, right at his boots, protruded a bony, gnarled hand covered in mud and slime. Daniel recoiled, screaming in horror, like a child awakened by a nightmare. The hand twitched, its fingers curling in a spasm, and another hand appeared from the ground, and then a shoulder, covered in torn, dirty cloth, and finally, a head. A dead man crawled out of the ground. His skin was greenish-gray, covered in sticky slime and swamp mud. His eyes were empty, cloudy, lifeless, and his mouth was ajar in a silent, eternal scream. He was dressed in torn, dirty clothes that had once perhaps been tourist gear. Daniel recognized him, despite the horrifying state he was in. It was Kevin Mason. Kevin, who had come to the Bitter Marshes for adventure and found his death here. Kevin the Dead looked at Daniel, his empty eyes seeming to penetrate into the depths of his consciousness, seeking out his most secret fears. He stretched out his bony, dirty hands towards him, as if inviting him to join him in eternal confinement. Daniel panicked, his mind overwhelmed by a wave of horror, paralyzing his will. He raised the shotgun with trembling hands and fired. The shot deafened the forest, echoing between the trees. Kevin the Dead was thrown back. He fell to the ground but immediately got up, as if nothing had happened. The bullets simply passed through him, causing him no harm. Daniel fired again and again, but Kevin kept coming, his steps slow and unsteady, but relentless. The bullets tore off pieces of rotting flesh, but it didn't stop him. Daniel realized that the shotgun was useless. These creatures aren't dead in the ordinary sense of the word. They can't be killed by bullets. They don't obey the laws of nature. They are the spawn of the swamp, something more than just the dead. In horror, he threw the shotgun to the ground and ran as fast as his old, exhausted legs would allow. He ran without looking back, stumbling over tree roots and fallen trunks, tearing through thorny bushes. He heard Kevin the Dead chasing him. His steps were slow but relentless, like an approaching nightmare. Daniel knew he couldn't run forever. He was too old, too tired. He had to come up with something, find a way to stop this creature, or at least buy himself some time. He stopped, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest like a mad drum. He looked around. He was in the middle of the thickest, most impassable swamp, surrounded by tall trees and viscous, stinking mud. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then he saw it. An old, dilapidated shed, standing away from the path, like a ghost from the past. Daniel had never seen it before, although he knew these places by heart. The shed was hidden behind dense thickets of bushes, as if someone was deliberately trying to hide it from prying eyes. Daniel rushed towards it, hoping that he could find shelter there, even temporary. He ran to the shed, stumbling at every step, and tugged at the rickety door. It was locked, the rusted lock creaking as if in its death throes. He gathered all his strength and pushed the door with his shoulder with all his might. The old boards cracked, the lock gave way, and the door swung inward, revealing the dark, dusty interior of the shed. Daniel flew inside, as if into the jaws of a beast. The shed was cluttered with old, rusty tools, broken furniture, yellowed newspapers, and all sorts of other junk. It was dusty and musty. The air was stale and foul, but it was dry, and that was the main thing. Daniel slammed the door shut and tried to slide the latch, but it broke under his fingers. He looked around for something to barricade the door with, to at least slow Kevin down a bit. He found an old, rickety table, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and moved it to the door. It wasn't very reliable, but it was better than nothing. He heard Kevin the Dead approach the shed. He heard his heavy, ragged breathing behind the door. He heard him scratching at the door with his claws, the scraping of claws on wood making his blood run cold. He heard him trying to break down the door, how it creaked and groaned under his pressure. Daniel held his breath, pressing his back against the wall. He knew he couldn't hold out like this for long. Kevin was much stronger than him. He was inhumanly strong. He looked around for a weapon, anything he could use to defend himself. He saw an old, rusty scythe hanging on the wall, among the cobwebs and dust. He grabbed it with trembling hands and held it tightly in his hands. The scythe was heavy and sharp, despite the rust. It could come in handy if he could muster the courage to use it. The door creaked with doubled force. Kevin was desperately trying to break it down. His rage was felt even through the wood. Daniel prepared for battle. He knew that this could be his last battle, that he would die here, in this cursed shed, far from home and family. The door burst open with a deafening crack. The table flew to the side like a chip of wood. Kevin the Dead entered the shed. He looked at Daniel with his empty, lifeless eyes and stretched out his bony, dirty hands towards him, as if inviting him into a last embrace. Daniel swung the scythe with all his might and hit Kevin on the head. The scythe slammed into his skull with a dull thud. Kevin staggered, but didn't fall, as if he hadn't even felt the blow. Daniel hit him again, and again. He hit and hit, putting all his rage and despair into every blow. Finally, after many blows, Kevin fell to the ground, as if felled, but he was still moving, his body twitching in convulsions, as if controlled by an invisible force. Daniel realized that the scythe wouldn't kill him. It would just slow him down, cause him pain. He had to come up with something that could kill this creature once and for all, destroy it forever. He remembered the old legend about the Bitter Marshes that his grandfather told him. It was said that in the very heart of the swamp, there was a place where the earth was saturated with evil, ancient power. A place where the souls of the dead could not find rest, where they were doomed to wander forever in search of comfort. A place where creatures like Kevin are born. And it was said that the only thing that could kill these creatures, destroy their cursed existence, was fire. Fire is purification. Fire is light. Fire is what darkness fears. Daniel looked around for something that could burn. He saw an old kerosene lamp standing on a table, covered in dust and cobwebs. He grabbed it with trembling hands and poured the rest of the kerosene on Kevin, dousing him from head to toe. Kevin growled, or rather howled, like a wounded beast, and tried to get up, but his movements were slow and unsteady. Daniel struck a match against the box with trembling hands and threw it on Kevin. The kerosene burst into flames instantly. Fire engulfed Kevin completely. Kevin screamed, or rather, let out a heart-wrenching wail, but his scream was silent, as if he had been deprived of his voice. He writhed in the fire. His body was engulfed in flames. The rotten flesh hissed and burned, filling the air with a terrible smell. Finally, after a few agonizing minutes, he stopped moving. Daniel backed away from the fire, watching Kevin burn. He felt the heat of the flame on his face, heard the crackling of burning wood. When the fire went out, only a pile of ashes remained of Kevin, mixed with earth and burnt remnants of clothing. Daniel sighed with relief. His body slumped with exhaustion. He had won, this time. He had been able to stop this creature, but he knew it was only a temporary victory. But he knew this was not the end. He knew that there were other creatures in the Bitter Marshes, other dead, thirsting for blood. And they would wait for him, patiently and relentlessly, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. He left the shed and looked at the swamp. It was just as dark and ominous as before, as if nothing had happened. The trees stood motionless, shrouded in a dense haze, and silence pressed on him from all sides. He knew that he had to leave here as soon as possible. He had to go back to town and tell everyone what he had seen, warn them about the danger lurking in the Bitter Marshes. But he also knew that no one would believe him. They would say that he was an old man who had gone crazy, that he had imagined it all, that he had just drunk too much moonshine. But he knew the truth. He had seen evil with his own eyes. He had felt its icy breath on his skin. He knew that the Bitter Marshes were a place where evil was real, where nightmares became reality, and that it would always be there, hiding in the depths of the swamp, waiting for its victims. He turned and walked back to his truck. He walked slowly, his old bones aching, every muscle aching with exhaustion. He knew that he would never forget what he had seen in the Bitter Marshes. These images would haunt him in his nightmares for the rest of his days. When he approached his truck, he saw that someone had left a note on the hood. He took it with trembling hands and read it. "Thank you for your help," the note read in uneven, shaky handwriting. "We will take his body." Daniel turned cold. His heart skipped a beat. He felt icy fear gripping his body. He slowly looked at the swamp, at the dark, ominous trees. He saw people coming out of the forest. They were dressed in black, long cloaks, hiding their faces and carrying lit torches in their hands, lighting their way. They were coming towards him. Daniel jumped into his truck in panic and started the engine. He jerked away from the spot and sped off down the broken forest road, kicking up clouds of dust and mud behind him. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw the people in black cloaks chasing him, running after him with torches in their hands. He drove as fast as he could, but they were getting closer, as if propelled by an invisible force. He knew that they would catch him. He knew that they would kill him. He knew that the Bitter Marshes would never let him go. He looked ahead at the road, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He knew that this was the end. And then he saw it. The sign on the side of the road, the same sign where it all began. Bitter Marshes, it read. Daniel screamed in despair. He realized that he was driving in circles. He had returned to where he had started. He was trapped in an eternal nightmare. The people in black cloaks caught up with him. They surrounded his truck, blocking all his escape routes. They pulled him out of the truck by force, ignoring his cries and pleas. They dragged him into the swamp, into its very heart, into the place where evil rules. He screamed, resisted, tried to break free, but they were too strong. Their grip was iron. They took him to that very tree with the bones, to that gruesome altar of death. They tied him to the tree, chained him to it, like a victim intended for a ritual. They looked at him with their empty, lifeless eyes, as if he wasn't a human, but just a piece of meat. They began to sing. Their singing was strange and eerie. It didn't resemble any melody he had ever heard. It made his blood run cold, evoked a primal fear in him. They sang about the Bitter Marshes, about their history, about their power, about their hunger. They sang about the evil that dwells in the swamp, about the ancient gods they worshipped. They sang about how he would soon become one of them, part of this cursed place. Daniel cried, prayed, begged them to let him go, but they didn't listen. They were deaf to his pleas. Their minds were consumed by darkness. He knew that he would die. He knew that his soul would never find rest. He would become part of the Bitter Marshes, an eternal prisoner of this cursed place. The people in black cloaks finished singing. They approached him with knives in their hands. Their blades gleamed in the light of the torches. They began to cut him, methodically and mercilessly, as if butchering an animal. He screamed in pain. His scream was drowned out by the singing of the people in black cloaks. They cut him until he died, until his body went limp and hung on the ropes tied to the tree. And when he died, they hung his bones on the tree, next to the bones of other victims of the Bitter Marshes. And now he hangs there, together with the others, an eternal guardian of this cursed place. He looks at the ground with his empty eye sockets, waiting for the next victim. He waits for the Bitter Marshes to swallow another soul, for another person to become part of their eternal nightmare. And so it will always be, because the Bitter Marshes never release their prey. They will wait patiently and relentlessly until a new victim wanders into their domain. And then the circle will close again, and another soul will be doomed to eternal torment in this cursed place. Years passed, decades replaced each other, but the Bitter Marshes remained unchanged, shrouded in mystery and evil. Legends about the cursed swamp were passed down from mouth to mouth, from father to son, warning people against approaching this place. Some, of course, didn't believe these stories, considering them the inventions of ignorant people, but those who dared to violate the border of the Bitter Marshes rarely returned. And, perhaps, somewhere in the depths of the swamp, among the rotten trees and ominous whispers, wanders the ghost of Daniel Parker, the old ranger who could never escape the Bitter Marshes. He wanders in the eternal darkness, warning those who accidentally stray into these lands, but his voice is only a faint whisper, drowned out by the voices of those who are already lost forever. The silence of the Bitter Marshes is the silence of death, the silence of despair, the silence of damnation, and it will last forever. Sometimes on moonlit nights, when the fog is especially thick, you can hear singing. The singing of the people in black cloaks who still wander the swamp in search of new victims for their dark gods. And if you ever happen to be near the Bitter Marshes, listen to your heart. If you feel fear, if you think someone is watching you, run. Run as far as you can. Because the Bitter Marshes never release those who have fallen into their nets. And if you still decide to enter the swamp, remember, you are not alone. There are those who are waiting for you, those who want to take your soul, and they will haunt you until you become part of the Bitter Marshes, part of their eternal nightmare. One day, a young woman named Sarah, a journalist fascinated by mysticism and the unexplained, heard about the legends of the Bitter Marshes, about cursed lands, about ghosts, and about mysterious rituals. She decided that this was the perfect topic for an article that would make her famous. She studied all available materials, questioned locals who reluctantly shared their fears and superstitions. She felt that she was approaching the solution to some terrible secret, and this only fueled her enthusiasm. Despite all the warnings, Sarah decided to go to the Bitter Marshes. She was confident in her courage and in her mind, considering herself invulnerable to the superstitions in which ordinary people believed. She entered the swamp alone, with a backpack full of equipment for filming and recording. She followed the paths that she had managed to find on old maps, but soon realized that the swamp did not want to let her in. The paths disappeared, the trees blocked the way, and strange sounds haunted her every step. With each step, Sarah felt her confidence melting and fear filling her heart. She saw strange shadows, heard whispers, and felt that someone was watching her. But she continued walking, convincing herself that it was just a figment of her imagination. But one day, she came across that very tree with bones. The sight was horrible, even for her, accustomed to the gruesome images she saw in her work. bones hanging from the branches like ghostly decorations, skulls, looking at the ground as if calling out to something terrible. Sarah felt panic engulfing her. She wanted to run, but her legs seemed to have grown to the ground. She couldn't move, as if paralyzed by horror. And then she saw them. The people in black cloaks came out of the forest, surrounding her on all sides. Their faces were hidden under hoods, and in their hands they held knives, glistening in the moonlight. Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sinister singing that the people in black cloaks began, singing that penetrated her mind, causing her to lose her mind. She tried to run away, but they grabbed her and dragged her to the tree. They tied her to the tree, next to other victims of the Bitter Marshes. They looked at her with their empty eyes, as if she wasn't a human, but just a piece of meat. They continued to sing, and Sarah felt her soul leaving her body. They cut her with knives, and the pain was unbearable. She screamed, but no one heard her screams. And when she died, they hung her bones on the tree, along with the bones of other victims of the Bitter Marshes. And now she hangs there, together with the others, an eternal guardian of this cursed place. She looks at the ground with her empty eye sockets, waiting for the next victim. She waits for the Bitter Marshes to swallow another soul, for another person to become part of their eternal nightmare. And so, it will always be, because the Bitter Marshes never release their prey. Sarah wanted to write an article about the Bitter Marshes, but instead, she became part of their legend. She became part of their eternal nightmare. She became part of the silence of the Bitter Marshes, and her story serves as a warning to all those who dare to disregard ancient beliefs, who consider themselves above superstition, and who think they can defeat the evil that lurks in this cursed place. Because the Bitter Marshes are waiting. They are always waiting, patiently and relentlessly, and sooner or later, they will take what is theirs. Not far from the marshes, in a small, God-forsaken town called Stillwater, lived an old man named Elijah. He was a local historian and local history expert who knew more about the Bitter Marshes than anyone else. Elijah was a strange man, a hermit who spent most of his time in his dusty library, surrounded by books and old maps. He had heard stories about the Bitter Marshes since childhood, and they haunted him all his life. One day, a young man, Jeremy, a student anthropologist who was writing a dissertation on local beliefs and folklore, came to Elijah. Jeremy was ambitious and purposeful. He wanted to uncover the secrets of the Bitter Marshes and become famous for his research. Elijah was initially suspicious of Jeremy. He didn't trust strangers, especially those who were interested in the Bitter Marshes. But Jeremy was persistent, and in the end Elijah agreed to share his knowledge with him. He told Jeremy about the ancient Indian tribes that once lived in these places, about their rituals and sacrifices. He told about the curse that lies on the Bitter Marshes, about the spirits of the dead who can't find rest. He told about the people in black cloaks who still perform their dark rituals in the depths of the swamp. Jeremy was intrigued. He didn't believe all these stories, but he understood that they had deep roots in the local culture. He decided to go to the Bitter Marshes to see everything with his own eyes. Elijah tried to dissuade him, warning him about the danger, but Jeremy was adamant. He said that he had to see everything with his own eyes in order to write a true dissertation. Then Elijah gave him an ancient amulet, which, he said, was supposed to protect him from evil spirits. He also gave him a map that indicated the most dangerous places in the swamp. Jeremy thanked Elijah and went to the Bitter Marshes. He followed the paths that Elijah had indicated to him, but soon realized that the swamp did not want to let him in. The paths disappeared, the trees blocked the way, and strange sounds haunted him every step. He felt that someone was watching him. He saw shadows, heard whispers, and sensed someone's presence. But he continued walking, convincing himself that it was just a figment of his imagination. One day, he came across that very tree with bones. The sight was horrible, but Jeremy wasn't scared. He was a scientist, not a superstitious peasant. He began to photograph and record everything he saw. Suddenly, he heard singing. He looked around, but didn't see anyone. The singing became louder and louder, penetrating his mind, causing him to lose his mind. He realized that the people in black cloaks were close. He tried to run away, but it was too late. They surrounded him on all sides. They grabbed him and dragged him to the tree. He resisted, but they were too strong. They tied him to the tree, next to other victims of the Bitter Marshes. They looked at him with their empty eyes, as if he wasn't a human, but just a piece of meat. They began to sing, and Jeremy felt his soul leaving his body. He remembered Elijah's words about the curse of the Bitter Marshes. He realized that it was true. They cut him with knives, and the pain was unbearable. He screamed, but no one heard his screams. And when he died, they hung his bones on the tree, along with the bones of other victims of the Bitter Marshes. A few weeks later, Elijah began to worry about Jeremy. He hadn't returned, and no one knew where he was. Elijah felt that something terrible had happened. He decided to go to the Bitter Marshes to find Jeremy. He knew that it was dangerous, but he couldn't do otherwise. He took his old shotgun and went to the swamp. He followed the paths that he knew by heart, but even he was scared. He felt the presence of evil that dwelt in the Bitter Marshes. He found the tree with the bones. The sight was horrible, but Elijah wasn't surprised. He knew what was happening here. He saw Jeremy's bones hanging on the tree. He cried. He knew that he couldn't do anything anymore. He buried the amulet that he had given Jeremy under the tree. He vowed to avenge the people in black cloaks. Elijah returned to Stillwater. He told everyone what had happened to Jeremy, but no one believed him. They said that he was an old man who had gone crazy. They said that he had imagined it all. But Elijah knew the truth. He knew that the Bitter Marshes were a place where evil was real. He decided to fight this evil himself. He began to collect information about the people in black cloaks. He learned who they were, where they came from, and what they wanted. He learned that they worship ancient gods who demand human sacrifices. He learned that they wanted to seize power over the world. Elijah decided to stop them. He gathered a group of volunteers who believed in his story. They armed themselves and went to the Bitter Marshes. They found the lair of the people in black cloaks. A battle began. The battle was fierce and bloody. Many died, but Elijah and his team won. They destroyed the lair of the people in black cloaks. They freed the souls of the victims of the Bitter Marshes. They put an end to the curse, but victory came at a heavy price. Elijah died in battle, but his sacrifice was not in vain. He saved the world from the evil that dwelt in the Bitter Marshes. Since then, the Bitter Marshes have become a peaceful place, but the legend of the cursed swamp is still alive. And people remember what happened to Jeremy and Elijah, and they know that evil can return at any moment. Because the Bitter Marshes are a place where evil will always be waiting. And if you ever find yourself near the Bitter Marshes, remember, be careful. Because the ghosts of the past dwell here, and they will never forget those who have invaded their domain. And remember that the silence of the Bitter Marshes is not just silence. It is the silence of death. It is the silence of despair. It is the silence of damnation. And this silence will last forever, reminding us that evil is always near, and that we must be ready to fight it.